Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. Thanks for tuning in. Now remember, if you want to be kept updated about tips on writing, leadership and teaching, make sure you hit that subscribe button to keep up to date. So today I'm going to be focusing on what constitutes effective feedback. It's the second in my series of videos all about teaching. The last video focused on what constituted effective teaching based on my years of experience, but also based on research from Education Development Trust. Today I'm going to be drawing on some research from the Education Endowment Foundation, as well as my own experiences when I'm going to discuss with you what constitutes effective feedback. So firstly, let's define what feedback is. So feedback is the communication, whether that is verbal or written, given to students following their completion of work. Now this can happen during a lesson, or it can happen after a lesson. It can be in written form or in verbal form. It can take many different formats. So let's get to it. Let's look at what Education Endowment Foundation says about what constitutes effective feedback. So who is or what is the Education Endowment Foundation? The way that they describe themselves is an independent charity that aims to break the link between family income and pupil achievement. And one of the pieces of research that they conducted was to look at the types of feedback that facilitate or improve student outcomes, student attainment. So they've broken this down into a number of criteria, the first of which, unsurprisingly, is the quality of instruction. So prior to even giving feedback, high quality instruction lays the foundation for good quality or high quality feedback. The reason high quality instruction or delivery or teaching, whatever term you wish to use, supports or lays the foundation for high quality feedback, which has a positive impact on student outcomes and attainment, is because you can build into high quality instruction and teaching formative assessment, where you identify gaps in learning and where you signal to students the ways in which they will be assessed. So things like very clear learning objectives and success criteria are ways in which you can establish for your students how they will be assessed and what the expected outcomes are. Now remember, in the previous video where I talked about effective teaching, there were references to learning objectives and learning outcomes or success criteria as being part of what would be seen as good or effective teaching. So here we see again a reference to that when it comes to feedback. And also in the previous video, formative assessment was referenced. So you can see the part that it plays both in the quality of instruction and teaching and feedback. Without formative assessment, you can't identify gaps in learning which need to be addressed through the feedback that you give. So the first criteria and the factor that contributes towards effective feedback is high quality instruction. Let's move on to the second factor. The second contributing factor for high quality feedback is the timing of that feedback. The way in which Education Endowment Foundation describe this is that they say that there is no set time for feedback, and it will depend, according to the teacher's discretion, on student responses to a task set. So that could be individual student responses, or it could be group understanding of the work that is being carried out. In addition, the timing for feedback will depend on the actual task that has been set. So effective or high quality feedback requires that timing is considered in terms of feedback, and the best kind of feedback is that which addresses gaps in learning for individuals or for groups of learners. Feedback that focuses on students' characteristics or on general understanding is less effective than feedback that focuses very much on gaps in learning relating to the task set or the self-regulation strategies required by students. So that's the second criteria that relates to effective feedback according to Education Endowment Foundation. The way that I understand this and how I will relate it to my own experiences is that when you give feedback in a classroom situation, it is most effective when it is directed specifically at students' understanding of misconceptions, that addresses misconceptions, so any gaps in learning are identified and are tackled. When you are addressing students generally, or you talk about general misconceptions, not specific to the task, it's less effective. In addition, an effective teacher or effective teaching would not include things where you are actually tackling characteristics of students. What you want to do is address gaps in their learning in relation to the task or to the subject. So, factor number 2 is the timing of feedback. The next element that feeds into effective feedback, according to Education Endowment Foundation, is consideration given to how students will use the feedback and how they will receive it. So if I deal with how they will receive it first, the way that I interpret that is building a climate where feedback is something that is usual and where trust is established between teacher and students, that the feedback, if it comes from the teacher, is received in a positive manner. Constructive feedback is then used effectively by the student. There are other ways in which feedback can be given. It doesn't always have to come from the teacher. So building a climate within the classroom where feedback, whatever form it is given, is constructive and not destructive, and therefore the student is able to receive it positively, will support it then being used effectively. Building in time for students to respond to feedback and to act on it is also part of this third factor that Education Endowment Foundation has found through research to be part of what constitutes effective feedback. So, factor number 3 in terms of what constitutes effective feedback is preparing how students will receive feedback and how they will use it. Let's move on to factor number 4. The next factor that is identified by Education Endowment Foundation as being necessary or as contributing to effective feedback is the careful consideration given to the purposefulness and the time taken for written feedback. Now, written feedback can take different forms, but good quality written feedback has been shown time and again to have impact on student outcomes and student attainment. But you don't want it to have a negative impact on the or be to the detriment of the teachers and the time taken for that feedback. So there are ways in which you can minimize the time taken for feedback, and there are various strategies that are used. Based on my own experiences, I can give you some examples such as traffic lighting and systems such as 2 stars and a wish, which is a very traditional way of providing 2 positive comments with 1 constructive comment on a piece of work. But in the moment feedback within lessons in a written form often can take a kind of highlighting or symbol effect. So using highlighting or symbols is a very quick way in which you can provide feedback to students and make it purposeful. So having recognized marking symbols such as errors that are identified, if you're talking about literacy such as spellings and punctuation, using abbreviations is one way, or circles and so on, is one way of speeding up the way in which you can give written feedback, having highlighting such as green for positive and yellow for needs to be worked on is another way. Red for absolutely wrong is a way of working or representing written feedback in a kind of quick way. The purposefulness of written feedback is something that is really important. It has to focus on the subject matter or the task itself, or on self-regulation strategies from the students, so that they need to go back and correct an error. You can also use things like success criteria and checklists as a way in to develop student feedback. You can also use that with peer feedback. So careful consideration given to the purposefulness of feedback, and the time taken for that feedback is another criteria that Education Endowment Foundation has identified as being a positive contributor to effective feedback. And I will probably do another video on the types of feedback that can be done, because I'm just giving a summary of what Education Endowment Foundation said at this point. So look out for forthcoming videos on more detail about the kinds of feedback that can be used and some real life examples of feedback to help you. The next factor identified by Education Endowment Foundation as contributing to student outcomes in a positive way through effective feedback is the careful consideration given to verbal feedback. So, as with written feedback, when to give that feedback is important. So the timing of that feedback and factoring in times within a lesson when you would give that feedback, or dedicating, for example, an entire lesson to verbal feedback while students act on feedback as well, is another strategy that could be used, certainly one that I have used in the past. So there are considerations that you can give to verbal feedback, because sometimes in the moment verbal feedback is a very time efficient way of providing high quality feedback to students that they can act on. But you need to take into consideration the points that were outlined previously by Education Endowment Foundation. Those are the quality of the instruction, the timeliness or the timing of the feedback, and how students are going to receive that feedback and going to act on it. So bear those all in mind when you are giving verbal feedback as well as when you're giving written feedback. The sixth and the last factor that Education Endowment Foundation identifies as being part of what constitutes as effective feedback that contributes to students' positive attainment and outcomes is the development of good quality feedback policies within an educational establishment or school. And those policies need to promote student feedback and exemplify it. So giving examples of what feedback might look like would be included in the policies. Overstipulating the frequency of feedback is seen by Education Endowment Foundation as not necessarily a positive way in which you should be promoting student feedback within a policy. However, in some establishments, based on my experience, it sometimes is necessary to give guidance to teachers about the frequency of feedback in order that students actually receive feedback, depending on the nature of the school and the nature of the teachers. Sometimes having some kind of guidance around the frequency of feedback can be helpful. Okay, so there you have it. You've got the 6 factors, according to Education Endowment Foundation, that contribute to positive student attainment based on effective feedback. So let's quickly run through all of those again so you have a summary. Okay, so factor number 1 was laying the foundations for effective feedback through high quality instruction. Factor number 2 was considering the timing of that feedback and making sure that it actually helps to move learning forward and identifies gaps in learning. Factor number 3 was making sure that you plan and consider how students are going to receive the feedback and use the feedback. Factor number 4 was careful consideration given to written feedback in terms of its purposefulness and the time efficiency of written feedback. Factor number 5 was about how to use verbal feedback effectively. Factor number 6 was about policies relating to student feedback. So look out for forthcoming videos where you'll get some more tips on writing, teaching and leadership. And remember that I'll be providing some additional guidance in terms of the types of feedback that you could give with some examples. I'll also be making a video soon about literacy and about communication in early years and how to develop early communication for students. So look out for that. Thanks for tuning in, and make sure you hit that subscribe button to keep updated of forthcoming videos. Look forward to seeing you next time.